This is BreakPoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Clemson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to BreakPoint This Week with John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Warren, it's April, and so what that means, first weekend of April, what that means is it's probably another week in Colorado where we go from 70 degrees to a blizzard like we did this week. And it also means March Madness is over. So I'm in a little bit of a depression because people who know me know that not only do I pay attention to March Madness, I pretty much don't get anything else done during the month of March. I'm a basketball junkie, and this was a really a great tournament. Congratulations to the University of Virginia. I'm a Duke fan, which I probably just lost half my listeners just from that point right there. But
right.
I'm a UVA fan, but it was a lot of fun watching the tournament, as it always is.
Well, it always is. I mean, you know, they're talking about changing the tournament, maybe making it double elimination or doing some other things. But, man, oh, man, they need to be careful what they mess with when it comes to that tournament because there's just always some great games. The interest is high front to back. And, of course, as you said, Virginia won this year with a really interesting story about their head coach.
Well, it's an interesting story about the whole program. I mean, look, I was in watching the game last year when they were a number 1 seed, like they were this year, playing a number 16 seed, like they were this year. The whole history of the tournament, a 16 never beat a 1 until last year. And it not only beat them by 20 points. And they were not only the number 1 seed, they were the overall number 1 seed. In other words, for the 4 number 1 seeds, they had the best run in the tournament and lost in the first round. Looked like they might do it again this year, but came back in the second half, had a couple miracles, especially in the Final Four and the Elite Eight, but went from kind of the most humiliating loss in NCAA tournament history to a national championship. That's a great story. So we heard a lot of words like redemption, a lot of Bible words having to do with basketball, like redemption story and things like that. But there was a lot more Bible in that whole program and Coach Bennett's kind of the way he does things. There's a lot more Bible than you'd expect.
Well, you know, John, he seems to be indicative, and I'm wondering what you think about this because I know you follow the game, of kind of, I don't know, a new style of coach or maybe a throwback to maybe the John Wooten style of coaching. I'm not sure what you would say about that, but he does seem to represent the kind of coach that's real different from, say, a Bobby Knight who would throw folding chairs across the floor, right?
So I've been thinking a lot about this because I sat down to write this story this past week, and I was on a plane in between a whole bunch of locations and didn't quite get it done, but I remember a moment. I know there's very little evidence of it today, but I played basketball in college. And my freshman year, I ended up transferring to a different school, had a terrific coach. But my freshman year, my coach was crazy. And what I mean is that he screamed at us from November to March. We were a team of 10 freshmen in a decently competitive NCAA Division III conference. But Division III means you're not getting paid. We weren't even stopping at restaurants after the game, you know. And I just remember this distinct moment where we were on the way back from having played terrible and having gotten beat. And his strategy to fix the fact that we were too short, you know, not skilled enough, and all freshmen was to scream at us. And I mean, literally smack chalkboards, cuss at us and all that. And we're on the way back from one of these games. And I just remember everyone on the bus sat up. And he was, you know, we're such a small school that he was our coach and our bus driver. We all sat up straight because he yanked off the interstate and pulled into this abandoned parking lot. And we were like, what on earth is it going to, I mean, literally it came to our minds that he might in the middle of the night have us out running suicides in a abandoned parking lot, because that's kind of the way he did things. But turns out he just had gone the wrong direction on the interstate and he turned around. But it says a lot that we were that scared. And, you know, that's kind of the kind of stereotype of a coach that I think many people have, especially at that elite level, you know, screamer, you know, make you run. So before the national championship game on Monday, Warren, Coach Dabo Sweeney, who was the football coach at Clemson. They won the national championship this year. I remember before watching the pregame of the national championship in football this year and hearing that the last thing that Coach Dabo does before all his players go onto the field is tell them all he loves them. And I think it was more than just, man, I love these guys that you kind of hear after the game. This is before the game.
Yep.
And not only that, and I know, Warren, hang with me here. I know this is going long, but not only that, but in the post-game interviews after Clemson had won the national championship, the players that were interviewed didn't just talk about their unity and that they fought hard and that they never gave up. They talked about, to a player, how much they loved each other. And you think to yourself, that's not usually what you hear from football players.
That's
and
right.
apparently Coach Dabo texted Coach Bennett of Virginia and said to him, and this is what I remember of the quote, "Let the light that shines through you be brighter than the light that shines on you." And the word that Coach Bennett used to describe this wonderful turnaround by the UVA team is the word faithful. That's not something you hear about a basketball team. I guess, to me, we have the national championship football coach, you have the national championship basketball coach, and you got other examples. Is this a new kind of coaching? Is it a Coach Wooden kind of coaching? Certainly both of these men, Coach Dabo and Coach Bennett, are men of deep faith, and they actually think that biblical principles are not something that are part of their personal lives, but actually to be integrated in how they understand the players that they coach, the sport that they're coaching, and what they're aiming at in terms of something beyond wins and losses. It's something to be looked at. This is not normal for college basketball and college football. That's my point.
I think that's right. There's plenty of colleges out there. You could probably find one example of just about everything that you wanted to find an example of, John. I'm sure there are bad coaches out there that are winning and good coaches, really good coaches that are building character that are losing. But I think you're right. It is striking that you've got Dabo Sweeney and Coach Bennett of Virginia, who both are, care about character. They care about the character of their players. They care about the spiritual well-being of their players, and they're winning ball games. That's a pretty cool thing to watch.
Well, it was, and it ended up being a great game in overtime. And speaking of basketball, since we're dedicating apparently this whole first segment to sports, you brought up a story this week, which is pretty cool too. Bobby Jones, known as one of the greatest defenders in the history of basketball, at least professional basketball, is finally made the vote to go into the Pro Basketball Hall of Fame. And here's another guy, not known for the things that say, I don't know, Charles Barkley was known for, not known for kind of the Wilt Chamberlain, version of off-court life, really known to be a really good guy.
Well, that's right. And, Bobby Jones was a defender. He was a tall, I think he was something close to 6'9", and the block shot was his favorite play, not the three-point shot, but the block shot. And so as a consequence of that, he didn't really put up sort of these gaudy numbers that you expect to get you into the Hall of Fame. He had a 12-year career in the NBA. He only scored about 12 points a game. For people who know the game, they know that that's not a whole lot. But every teammate he ever had talked about what a great teammate he was. Every team he was ever on made the playoffs. They won the NBA championship in 1983. He was just known as a great ambassador of the game, a fantastic teammate, and someone who, after he left his playing years, or after he was through with his playing years, came, home to the North Carolina and has been real active in Christian ministry down here as well. I live in Charlotte, and he's from Charlotte. So, this is an example of, once again, nice guys not finishing last. It took a long time. It took 30 years after he retired to get into the Hall of Fame, but it's a really great accomplishment, and I think one worth celebrating.
Well, you're listening to BreakPoint this week. If you come to breakpoint.org, click on the link on the homepage. It says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. We will link you to a couple of resources on these stories. First, my BreakPoint commentary this past week on Coach Bennett and just kind of this different kind of coaching here that we're talking about. And also, Warren, you will have here a column on Bobby Jones and your Restoring All Things series.
That's right.
Coming up on Friday. So again, come to breakpoint.org, click on the link there on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. We'll link you to those resources. Stay with us. You're listening to BreakPoint This Week with Warren Smith. I'm John Stonestreet. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Well, we're back on BreakPoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. And Warren, last week I had the privilege to be on Friday and Saturday up in Ohio, in Cincinnati, and then in Columbus with our friends at the Center for Community Values, which is one of the family policy councils, the one there in Ohio. And they were really buzzing, all night about the potential and the possibility of this heartbeat bill. Now, there's a whole story behind this. The heartbeat bill basically a bill that says abortion's illegal after the heartbeat can be detected. That puts it back somewhere around 6 or 7 weeks. It actually came out of the legislature last term, back when Governor John Kasich was in office, and he refused to sign it. Well, one of the issues that came up in that election is that Governor DeWine promised to sign the bill, and that's what happened this week. The bill, again, came out of the House and the Senate. It passed, and Governor DeWine fulfilled his promise, and he signed it. And so one of the most kind of pro-life bills we've seen in the states in a long time.
Well, yeah, and it's likely to be one of the most pro-life bills that we're going to see. I don't want to say ever, John, because obviously you and I both hope that abortion will, be banned and unthinkable in our future. But this really does ban abortion in almost every single case. I mean, because a heartbeat can be detected in an unborn child often before many parents even know that they're pregnant. Many mothers even know that they're pregnant. So it's highly likely that this bill is going to be the bill that does more to protect the unborn child than any that we will see for many years to come. I should also mention that a similar bill is on the desk of Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. He has also promised to sign it, but at least as you and I are talking right now, he has so far not signed it, and I'm a little worried that he might be succumbing to some of the liberal pressure that has been brought to bear on him. But it didn't affect Mike DeWine. He was strong. He signed it right away.
He signed it within 24 hours and said he was going to, and so on. There's a whole bunch of interesting things about the Ohio story. One is that after it failed, a pregnancy care center director jumped in the race and ran for the state legislature in Ohio just to resurrect this bill. And she did. And she's taken a good bit of abuse from those on the other side because of it. And it's just really an amazing story there. But, of course, we also have the reality of, Warren, and we need to talk through this, that there's no kind of illusion that this is going to go unchallenged. Whenever a pro-life bill to this extent, we saw it in Texas, we've seen it other places, whenever these things pass, the legal challenges follow. But that's actually the point. That's what we need to talk about. One of these challenges to what is the most liberal kind of abortion set of laws that really almost in the developed world that America has. One of these limiting legislations is going to be challenged, and when it gets challenged, the Supreme Court's going to have to pick it up. And I think that's really the reason that we're seeing so many of these proliferate on both sides. One side is trying to ensure Roe v. Wade protections at the state level. The other is trying to bring up from the state level the sort of bill that's going to challenge Roe v. Wade and hopefully see that decision go into the dustbin of history.
Well, and certainly, John, I know you and I and many of our listeners hope that is in fact the case, that Roe will go to the dustbin of history. But, we've got to be vigilant about this because even though we're getting these good laws and we've got, a good governor like Mike DeWine signing it, one of the things that struck me was the coverage of that law, that a lot of the coverage of the heartbeat bill in Ohio and in Georgia as well was most restrictive laws in the nation rather than why not have a headline that says a law that protects the unborn, a law that protects the innocent? You would never see a headline like that in the mainstream paper. And that relentless drumbeat of the mainstream media and the cultural narrative that laws that protect the unborn somehow restrict the rights of mothers or are restrictive to choice is going to be the counter narrative that liberals and progressives and the pro-abortion movement are going to keep putting out there. So we've got to be both vigilant and we've also got to be faithful in telling the true story that we're protecting innocent human life with these laws.
Yeah, sometimes my spiritual gift of snarkiness comes out on Twitter. And I tweeted that this morning, knowing from the conversations that I had last week when I was with those good people in Ohio that the governor was going to sign this bill, that, here's the easiest prediction of the day. New York legislators celebrated a bill about killing babies all the way up to birth. The sitting governor promoted allowing parents and doctors to confer about whether to save babies after birth. But the heartbeat bill in Ohio will be the one that's called extreme by the media. That's certainly
that's what happened.
What we're going to see. It's exactly what happened. Well, let's go to another story, too. This has to do with something we talked about on BreakPoint, and we got some interesting comments on Facebook and Twitter and social media and on our website. which is this whole idea about the limits of religious freedom, as well as to who religious freedom belongs to. So, interesting story out of Texas that the Supreme Court just ruled on March 25th, 7-2, that Patrick Henry Murphy could not be executed without allowing his spiritual advisor to be present. Now, here's the backstory. In the state of Texas, if someone on death row asked for the spiritual advisor to be present at their execution, if they were Christian, no problem. If they're Muslim, no problem. But because Patrick Henry Murphy is a Buddhist, that the state refused to allow his Buddhist spiritual advisor to be present. So basically this freedom to extend, the right to kind of have spiritual advisement at your execution, which would seem something that we'd want to encourage as Americans, that religious freedom didn't extend to those who were Buddhist and presumably other religions as well. Went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that that had to be the case, that this was unjust discrimination against Patrick Henry Murphy. So what's interesting is rather than extending this right to Buddhists, the state of Texas decided to allow no one to have a spiritual advisor or a member of a clergy. So now Christians have lost their religious freedom to have that as well. This is an example of a real issue that we face, and we talked about it this week on BreakPoint, that balance between when religious freedom promotes the public good, protects those beliefs that we have, and then the extent to which it would extend to people of other faiths. This isn't going to be less confusing as we go forward. It's going to be more confusing.
Yeah, John, when I read this story, a couple of things occurred to me. One was just the sort of the way that they just took an axe to the problem. Rather than allowing the Buddhist chaplain, they just forbade all chaplains from there. And it's what Luke Goodrich, who was with the religious liberty defense firm, the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, called a leveling down. In other words, rather than granting the right and sort of raising everybody to the same level, raising the Buddhists to the level of others, they leveled the playing field, but they leveled it down. I thought that was a pretty apt description.
Yeah, and we're seeing this in other parts of the Western world as well. In fact, on Thursday's BreakPoint, we talked about this and really not only talked about the Texas case and as far as clergy being present at executions, but also Quebec. Their new government recently proposed a law that would bar public employees from wearing religious symbols at work. And really the case was an elementary school teacher in Montreal who's a Muslim, and she was basically, it was whether she could wear a hijab or a headscarf or not. But of course, the same law that bans a headscarf or a hijab, which some of us who have concerns about radical Islam in the West, but the same laws that ban that Muslim expression is the same laws that could be extended to ban a Jew from wearing a yarmulke or a Sikh a turban, and I mean, for that matter, a Christian to wear a cross. And we've seen actually challenges to Christians. Here, this is a big difference, as one of our commenters pointed out. There's an expectation for Muslim women to wear hijabs in many examples of their faith. But there's not an expectation. You don't have to wear a cross to be a Christian. And yeah, many Christians are forbidden to wear a cross just because of the religious symbolism. And of course, we had that whole case of the memorial in Maryland where the cross was taken down, and the Supreme Court tried to argue, well, listen, a cross isn't really a religious symbol. Well, wait a minute, that's getting us around the problem of whether a memorial should be taken down by a secular state, but wait a minute, a cross is a Christian symbol and everyone knows it. We don't want to lose that reality in the public square. This is tricky grounds. And at the same time, we have to have limits on religious freedom. You can't just do anything you want because you say you're religious. You can't infinitely delay your execution. You can't commit cannibalism because that's part of your deeply held religious beliefs. These are all parts of trying to figure out these boundaries and lanes. And it's even more problematic when you have a government that seems to come in with the assumption of secularism up front.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. And that, John, when we started talking about this story, you said that the Supreme Court decision was 7-2, that Texas could not execute Patrick Henry Murphy. But it was interesting to me that Neil Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas, two conservatives on the court, dissented in that. So you had actually had a divided conservatives in this particular case. So you're right, it's tricky ground. But I think that even though it can be complicated and confusing, I think that when we stand on this principle, that we stand for religious liberty, not just for Christians, but for everyone, that we're almost always on pretty safe ground.
You're listening to BreakPoint this week. Come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. One of the things that we'll link you to is a set of terrific resources that we have for you this coming Holy Week, which starts with some terrific conversations on the podcast with J. Warner Wallace about the evidence for the resurrection. We also have a free devotional that you can download on the 7 last sayings of Christ from the cross, something that our writers at BreakPoint have put together. Again, come to breakpoint.org and we'll link you to all of those resources. You're listening to BreakPoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet with Warren Smith. Stay with us.
You can learn more about BreakPoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Welcome back to BreakPoint This Week. I'm Warren Smith with John Stonestreet. And John, as you and I are having this conversation, I'm in Washington, D.C., where I was with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention at a little press conference this afternoon, sort of, I guess you could say, the unveiling of a statement on artificial intelligence. And I'll tell you that being there face-to-face, it was really instructive and helpful, and a lot of really great people there. Mark Tooley with the Institute for Religion and Democracy, Jennifer Patterson, who is one of our board members and a Heritage Foundation a senior executive. And this statement on artificial intelligence was extremely profound in putting forth the image of God as the human beings made in the image of God as a core principle. And I know, John, you were one of the very first signers of this document.
Well, I mean, there's been tons of times over the last 10 years where I've stopped in the middle of a talk going, I can't believe I'm talking about this. And about half of those have to do with artificial intelligence. The other half have to do, by the way, with our culture's quick journey into the abyss of sexuality. But the other side of this, though, is kind of this artificial intelligence and even the transhumanist discussion. Now, those might be two words that just seems like science fiction for so many of our listeners. But this, what science fiction is now science fact. The opening monologue of a Saturday Night Live broadcast last year was a comedian saying, hey, do you realize how much of your time you spend proving to robots that you're not a robot? And of course, he was talking about how many websites do you go to or purchases you try to make online, and they ask, are you a robot? Well, it's a robot that is judging whether you're a robot. I mean, and this is, Siri and Alexa, and it's going into our cars, and not to mention going into medical technology. Artificial intelligence is one of the examples of where technology outpaces our ethics. On BreakPoint, we've talked about this a few times. We talk a lot, obviously, about artificial reproductive technologies and how that has outpaced our ethics. This is not a small issue. What was once science fiction is science fact. What was once this is where we're headed is different. And, I interviewed recently on our podcast someone who was talking about this, and it was such an interesting observation. A lot of us, when we think about the future and what we thought the future would be, we think of the Jetsons, In the Jetsons, nothing really changed about who we were or how we thought about ourselves. Basically, all the technology made it more convenient for us to be ourselves. But that's not the way that technology is progressing. The way technology is largely progressing is that it's actually influencing how we understand ourselves as human beings. There's an integration of technology and the human person, and it's based on a worldview that certainly is not grounded in any understanding of two things that are essential if you're not going to make a big mistake. Number one, the image of God. Number two, the fall. And so that's why I was eager and quick to sign this statement. And to me, it needs to be an encouragement. We need Christians to run into this field. Because listen, the genie's not going back into the bottle, right?
That's right.
So we've got to run into this ethical challenge professionally and personally, not away from it.
Well, and John, people that think that, wow, artificial intelligence, this is just, I'm more concerned about other issues. Well, artificial intelligence affects us when we are talking about self-driving cars. I was in a car just today where it wouldn't let you change lanes easily, because it was already thinking for you. So everything from self-driving cars to autonomous vehicles, that there are so many elements of our life that are already being impacted by artificial intelligence. You mentioned Alexa a few moments ago. There was a television commercial that was going to promote Alexa about a year or two ago, and they actually had to think, how are they going to use the word Alexa in the commercial without activating every Alexa that's already being used all across the country and overloading the system. It's just amazing problems that we are having to deal with today already because of artificial intelligence. It's going to be an issue that's even going to be more prevalent in the future.
Yeah, and the challenge would be great enough if we were just dealing with the amazing advances and the things that we're able to do. Well, listen, come to breakpoint.org, click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. This statement called Artificial Intelligence, an Evangelical Statement of Principles was put out by the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, signed by our friends like Matt Chandler, Dan Darling, Jim Daly, David Dockery, Ronnie Floyd, for the Southern Baptist Convention, J.D. Greer, Michael Horton, and I was privileged to sign it as well. Again, come to breakpoint.org. Well, thanks for joining us today on Breakpoint This Week. Don't miss a single program by subscribing to the Breakpoint podcast wherever you listen to your podcast or subscribe to your podcast. Just look for the Breakpoint podcast, and you never have to miss any of these conversations between Warren and me, as well as any of our Breakpoint commentaries on the important cultural stories of the week. For Warren Smith, I'm John Stonestreet. Thanks for joining us on Breakpoint This Week.